Emma leaned out of the car window, inhaling the crisp mountain air as their SUV bumped along the winding dirt road. The cabin appeared ahead, nestled among towering pines. Its weathered wooden exterior and stone chimney gave it a rustic charm. "This is perfect," Emma said, her voice tinged with excitement. "No emails, no traffic, just us and nature." Jack chuckled, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the road narrowed. "And no neighbors. Isolation included, free of charge." They parked and unloaded their bags, the forest's tranquility broken only by chirping birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. The cabin's interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a plush couch facing a window overlooking the woods. Emma explored the rooms while Jack carried in their gear. "This place is straight out of a brochure," Emma said, setting a lantern on the coffee table. She pulled a pair of hiking boots from her bag. "Let's check out the trails before we lose daylight." Jack grabbed his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. He never went into the wilderness unarmed, even during a vacation. "Just in case," he said when Emma shot him a questioning look. The couple set off, following a narrow path that wound through dense foliage. The air was cooler under the canopy, and the silence seemed heavier the farther they walked. They reached a ridge with a view of the valley below, taking in the breathtaking sight of rolling hills bathed in golden light. "This was such a good idea," Emma said, snapping a photo. "We should make this an annual thing." Jack smiled, but then tilted his head. "Do you hear that?" Emma paused, listening. A faint hum, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the woods. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, and sent a shiver down her spine. "What is that?" "Could be a power line or something," Jack offered, though he didn't sound convinced. They lingered a moment before heading back, the hum fading into the background. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. Jack lit a fire while Emma prepared dinner. They ate in comfortable silence, the crackle of flames filling the room. As they settled in for the night, Emma noticed the quiet. No distant hum, no wildlife, nothing. She pushed the thought aside, attributing it to the isolation. But as they climbed into bed, an unease settled over her. The woods outside felt vast, unknowable, and for the first time she wondered if being so far from civilization was really the dream escape they'd imagined. The morning light filtered through the cabin's windows, casting warm rays on the wooden floor. Emma stretched and yawned, the unease of the previous night pushed to the back of her mind. She and Jack spent the morning drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sunlight dance through the trees. After breakfast, Emma decided to tidy up the cabin. As she moved the couch to sweep behind it, she noticed something wedged between the back of the couch and the wall. It was a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn and stained. Curious, she sat on the couch and began flipping through its pages. "What's that?" Jack asked, walking in from the porch with his rifle in hand. "A journal," Emma replied. "Looks like someone left it here." The handwriting was messy but legible, and the entries started off mundane, notes about the weather, meals, and hikes. But as she read further, the tone shifted. The writer mentioned hearing strange noises at night, footsteps on the roof, faint tapping on the windows, and an eerie hum that seemed to come from the forest. Emma felt a chill creep up her spine as she read aloud. "We thought it was animals at first, but the noises keep getting closer. Last night there was knocking on the door. When we opened it, no one was there." Jack leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. "That's creepy." Emma flipped to the final entry. The words were hurried, almost frantic. "The lights are back. They're brighter now and closer. We saw something in the woods today. Tall, gray, not human. They're watching us. We're leaving tomorrow, but I'm not sure we'll make it." The entry ended abruptly, with no signature. Emma stared at the page, her heart pounding. "Do you think this is real, or just someone messing around?" Jack shook his head, a frown etched on his face. "I don't know, but it's weird they left this here." The unease from the previous night returned, gnawing at Emma. She placed the journal on the coffee table, but its presence seemed to fill the room with an oppressive weight. That afternoon they decided to hike a shorter trail closer to the cabin. The forest felt different, darker, more oppressive. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder, her imagination running wild. As they reached a clearing, Jack froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Emma followed his gaze and saw a strange mark etched into a tree trunk. It was a perfect circle, surrounded by jagged lines radiating outward. The mark looked fresh, as if it had been burned into the bark. "Let's go back," Emma said, her voice trembling. Jack nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. As they made their way back to the cabin, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, and the oppressive silence of the woods followed them inside. The fire crackled in the hearth as Emma and Jack sat silently on the couch, the leather-bound journal lying untouched on the coffee table. The unease in the air was palpable. Emma sipped her tea, her eyes darting to the windows every few moments. "We're letting this journal mess with our heads," Jack finally said, breaking the silence. He leaned forward, picking it up. "It's just a story. People write all kinds of weird stuff for kicks." Emma wasn't so sure, but she didn't argue. She wanted to believe him, to dismiss the unease as nothing more than paranoia. That night they climbed into bed early, hoping sleep would ease their growing anxiety. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional pop of the dying fire. Emma drifted off quickly, but Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His fingers rested on the revolver tucked under his pillow, a precaution he now found himself thankful for. A faint sound stirred him from his thoughts. He held his breath, listening. It came again, a soft, deliberate scraping noise like something brushing against the cabin walls. Jack sat up, straining to hear more. The sound moved, circling the cabin. "Emma," he whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned softly. "What is it?" "Listen." The sound stopped. They sat in silence for a long moment, the stillness more unnerving than the noise. Jack rose and grabbed his rifle. "Stay here," he said firmly, though Emma was already climbing out of bed. "Like hell I'm staying here alone," she said, grabbing a flashlight. Jack frowned but didn't argue. Together they stepped into the main room. The fire had died down, casting long shadows across the walls. Jack moved to the window and peered out. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the yard. "Nothing. It's probably an animal," Jack muttered, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. Emma flinched as something thudded overhead. Jack swung the rifle toward the ceiling, his jaw tightening. The noise came again, heavier this time, like footsteps moving across the roof. "Animals don't walk like that," Emma whispered. Jack motioned for her to stay back as he moved toward the door. He eased it open, rifle at the ready, and stepped onto the porch. The flashlight beam swept over the roof, the trees, the yard. The woods loomed silently, their darkness impenetrable. Nothing. Jack exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. "It's clear." But as they turned to go back inside, Emma froze. "Jack, look." She pointed to the tree line. Two small lights hovered in the darkness, perfectly round and unnervingly still. They weren't stars, nor reflections. They almost seemed like eyes. Jack raised the rifle again, his hand steady. "Get inside," he said quietly. Emma didn't argue this time. She backed into the cabin, locking the door behind her. Jack remained on the porch, staring into the woods. The lights blinked out, leaving only darkness. When Jack finally came back inside, his face was pale. "We're keeping the lights on tonight." Neither of them slept. The next morning dawned gray and overcast. The light diffused through thick clouds. Jack and Emma sat at the small kitchen table, their breakfast untouched. The events of the previous night hung heavily in the air. "Maybe we should leave," Emma said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, hesitant. Jack shook his head. "It's just a couple of weird nights. We're probably scaring ourselves over nothing. Let's go for a hike, clear our heads." Emma didn't argue, though unease settled in her stomach. They packed lightly. Jack carried his rifle and revolver, while Emma grabbed the flashlight and a water bottle. The trail they chose led deeper into the woods, a narrow path lined with towering trees. The dense canopy muted the sounds of the forest, creating an eerie quiet. They walked in silence, both lost in their thoughts. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, but the trail behind them was empty. Jack remained alert, his grip on the rifle firm. After an hour, they reached a clearing with a small stream running through it. The sound of water was a welcome reprieve from the oppressive silence. Emma knelt to fill her bottle while Jack scanned the surrounding trees. "Do you see that?" Jack's voice was barely above a whisper. Emma looked up sharply. "What?" Jack pointed to a spot just beyond the clearing. At first Emma saw nothing but shadows. Then something moved, a quick fluid motion that disappeared as quickly as it came. "It's probably a deer," she said, though her voice wavered. "That wasn't a deer." Jack's tone was firm. He raised the rifle, peering through the scope. "Stay here." "Jack, don't—" But he was already moving toward the trees. Emma stood frozen, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. The minutes stretched on, each one more agonizing than the last. Finally, Jack returned, his face grim. "There's nothing there," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's head back." As they made their way back to the cabin, the forest seemed to close in around them. The shadows deepened, and the silence grew heavier. Emma's heart raced with every step. Halfway back they heard it, a low, rhythmic hum, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to vibrate through the air, coming from all around them. Emma froze, her eyes wide. "Jack," she whispered. "I hear it," he said, scanning the trees. His voice was calm, but his grip on the rifle tightened. The hum grew louder, more oppressive. Emma thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye, something tall and thin slipping between the trees. She grabbed Jack's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Run," Jack said sharply, pulling her along. They broke into a sprint, the hum following them like a predator stalking its prey. Emma's chest burned, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't dare look back. When they finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing around the cabin, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening. Emma collapsed onto the porch steps, her legs trembling. Jack scanned the tree line, his rifle raised. "Get inside," he said, his voice tight. Emma didn't need to be told twice. The cabin felt smaller now, its cozy charm replaced by an oppressive sense of confinement. Emma paced the living room, glancing toward the windows every few moments. Jack sat at the table, his rifle resting across his lap, his revolver holstered at his side. His eyes were fixed on the tree line visible through the front window. "This isn't paranoia anymore," Emma said, her voice cracking. "Something's out there, Jack." Jack nodded grimly. "I know, but we're safer here than out in those woods right now. We'll leave first thing in the morning." Emma bit her lip, staring at the leather-bound journal still sitting on the coffee table. She hadn't touched it since the night before, but it seemed to radiate a sinister energy. She wondered if the previous tenants had felt the same helplessness, the same fear. As darkness fell, the hum returned, faint at first but growing louder. Emma's stomach twisted into knots as the sound reverberated through the cabin. She looked at Jack, who had already risen to his feet, rifle in hand. "Stay away from the windows," he instructed, his voice steady but tense. The hum wasn't alone this time. A soft tapping began, coming from the back of the cabin. It was rhythmic and deliberate, as though something or someone was testing the walls. Emma's breathing quickened. Jack moved to the rear window, his movements slow and deliberate. He peeked through the curtain, his expression hardening. Nothing. The tapping stopped, replaced by a loud thud on the roof. Emma jumped, clutching the flashlight in her trembling hands. "It's on the roof," she whispered. Jack moved toward the door. "Stay here," he said, unlocking the deadbolt. "Are you insane?" Emma hissed. "Don't go out there." Jack didn't respond. He stepped onto the porch, his flashlight slicing through the darkness as he aimed his rifle at the roof. Emma held her breath, her ears straining for any sound. The silence was broken by a loud crash from the side of the cabin. Jack spun toward the noise, his flashlight catching a fleeting glimpse of movement. Tall, thin, and impossibly fast. He fired a shot, the sound echoing through the forest. Emma screamed, her hands flying to her ears. "Get inside!" Jack shouted, backing toward the door. He slammed the door shut behind him, bolting it with shaking hands. "I saw it," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's not human." Emma's knees gave out, and she sank onto the couch. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what Jack had seen. "What do we do?" "We wait," Jack said, gripping his rifle tightly. "They want us scared. I'm not giving them that satisfaction." The hum intensified, and the lights in the cabin flickered. Emma clutched the flashlight like a lifeline. The walls of the cabin felt thinner now, as though they wouldn't hold against whatever was out there. Through the window, Emma thought she saw shadows moving between the trees, circling closer. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down she knew the truth. They weren't alone. The hum vibrated through the walls, relentless and unyielding. Jack and Emma sat huddled in the living room, their backs to the fireplace. Jack's rifle was aimed at the door, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Then the lights went out. Emma stifled a scream as darkness swallowed the cabin. Jack turned on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. "Stay close," he whispered. The hum seemed to shift, growing deeper, more resonant. The air itself felt heavier. Emma's chest tightened and she struggled to breathe. Then she saw them. Through the window, pale figures emerged from the tree line. They moved with an eerie, gliding motion, their tall, thin frames unnaturally still despite the uneven ground. Their skin was a sickly gray, smooth and reflective under the moonlight. Their heads were bulbous, with large obsidian black eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "Jack," Emma's voice was barely audible. "I see them," he said, his voice steady but low. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, his eyes never leaving the window. The Greys stopped at the edge of the yard, their heads tilting in unison. They stood perfectly still, watching. The hum intensified, and Emma felt a pressure in her skull, like a rising headache. Her pulse thundered in her ears. One of the Greys raised a spindly arm pointing toward the cabin. The others began to move, gliding closer with an unnatural grace. "They're coming," Emma said, panic lacing her words. Jack stood, his movements calm and deliberate. He raised the rifle, aiming through the window. "Stay down." Emma dropped to the floor, her hands over her ears as the hum became almost deafening. She watched as Jack fired, the crack of the rifle shattering the oppressive noise. The recoil barely fazed him. Through the window, one of the Greys staggered, a dark smear spreading across its torso. It didn't fall or cry out, just stood there staring. Then it tilted its head as if curious. "They don't go down easy," Jack muttered, firing again. The second shot hit the same Grey, and this time it collapsed to the ground. The others didn't flinch or react. They simply continued their approach. "They're testing us," Jack said, stepping back from the window. He grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her to her feet. "We need to fortify the doors and windows, now." Emma scrambled to push the couch against the front door while Jack reinforced the rear. The pounding in her head was relentless, the hum vibrating through every fiber of her being. She thought she heard faint whispers, but she shoved the thought aside. She wouldn't let her mind betray her. Jack returned to her side, his face pale but resolute. "They're not breaking in tonight," he said, though his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. Emma wasn't so sure. As the Greys gathered outside, their lifeless black eyes fixed on the cabin, she had the sinking realization that this was only the beginning. The night grew colder, the temperature inside the cabin dropping unnaturally fast. Emma huddled under a blanket, trembling, though not entirely from the cold. Jack paced the room, his rifle gripped tightly, his eyes darting to the windows. Outside, the Greys had fully surrounded the cabin. Their tall, thin silhouettes stood motionless against the backdrop of the dark forest, their black eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. They didn't make a sound. The only noise was the relentless hum, vibrating through the air and rattling Emma's nerves. "They're waiting," Jack muttered, glancing at Emma. "For what? I don't know." Emma shook her head, her voice trembling. "They don't need to wait. They could break in any time they want." Jack stopped and turned to her, his expression hard. "If they try, I'll stop them." Before Emma could respond, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. It wasn't the door or windows. It came from the roof, the sound of something heavy walking above them. Slow, deliberate footsteps creaked against the wooden shingles, moving toward the edge of the cabin. "They're testing us," Jack said, his jaw tightening. He raised the rifle, aiming it at the ceiling as though he could see through it. "They want to see how we'll react." Emma clutched the flashlight, her knuckles white. "What do we do?" "We don't panic," Jack said. "That's what they want. We stay inside, keep them guessing." The footsteps stopped, replaced by a loud thud, then another. The noise moved around the cabin, shifting from the roof to the walls, like something dragging its limbs along the exterior. Suddenly a loud knock echoed from the front door. Emma jumped, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, illuminating the doorway. Jack aimed the rifle at the door, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Don't move," he whispered. The knock came again, harder this time, as if whatever was outside wanted to make its presence known. Then the doorknob rattled, slow and deliberate, as though it was testing the lock. Emma's breathing quickened. "It's trying to get in." Jack didn't respond. His focus remained on the door, his body tense. Another knock, louder than before, then silence. The hum outside grew louder, filling the room like a pressure cooker about to explode. Jack glanced at the windows, then at Emma. "They're trying to make us crack," he said. "We can't give them that." But before he could say more, the back door rattled violently. Jack turned, raising the rifle as the sound intensified. Something slammed against the door, the wood groaning under the force. "Move the table," Jack barked, and Emma scrambled to push the heavy wooden table against the door. Jack joined her, shoving it into place as the pounding continued. The grays outside didn't relent. Shadows darted past the windows, their movements fast and unnatural. Emma felt the walls closing in, the oppressive noise and pressure making it hard to think. "They're going to get in," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jack gritted his teeth. "Not tonight." The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum. Emma looked at Jack, her heart pounding. Why did they stop? Jack didn't answer. He was staring at the window where a pair of black eyes peered in, unblinking. The black eyes at the window were paralyzing, like staring into an endless void. Emma's breath hitched, her body frozen in place. Jack reacted first, raising his rifle and firing. The glass shattered, and the figure outside vanished into the darkness. "Emma, focus!" Jack yelled, snapping her out of her daze. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the window. "We can't stay here. They're just playing with us now." Emma nodded, her voice trembling. "How do we get out? They're everywhere." Jack paced the room, his mind racing. "We wait until first light. They seem to move slower in the daylight. When the sun comes up, we make a run for the truck." Emma glanced at the shattered window. The hum had grown quieter, but she could still feel its oppressive weight in the air. "What if they don't let us make it to morning?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Then we fight." He began moving through the cabin, securing what he could. Furniture was pushed against doors and windows, makeshift barricades meant to slow the Greys down. Emma followed him, her hands trembling as she helped stack chairs and reinforce the table against the back door. "I don't understand what they want," Emma said, her voice cracking. "Why us? Why this cabin?" Jack paused, looking at her. "It's not about us. They were here before we were. The journal, the people who wrote it, they didn't make it out. But we will." The determination in his voice steadied Emma, if only a little. She watched as Jack checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded. "I'll go first in the morning," he said. "You stay behind me, keep low. If I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back." Emma nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "What if we don't make it?" Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "We will." The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The Greys continued their game, tapping on the walls, rattling the doors, and circling the cabin. Every so often Emma caught glimpses of their tall, thin frames through the cracks in the barricades. They didn't seem to need to breathe or blink, and their movements were so fluid they seemed almost like projections. As the first hints of dawn broke over the horizon, the hum outside began to fade. Jack noticed the change immediately. "This is our chance," he said. "We move now." Emma grabbed the flashlight and a small backpack with essentials, though she doubted they'd need anything but speed. Jack held the rifle at the ready, his revolver holstered but within easy reach. "Stay close," he whispered, unblocking the front door. He eased it open, the cool morning air rushing in. The woods were eerily still, the Greys nowhere in sight. Emma felt a flicker of hope, but it was short-lived. As they stepped onto the porch, the humming returned. Low, almost imperceptible, but growing. "They know," Jack muttered. "Go, now." He stepped off the porch, rifle raised, leading the way toward the truck parked 50 yards away. Emma followed, her heart hammering in her chest. Shadows moved in the trees, and she knew the Greys were watching. Then, just as they reached the halfway point, the Greys stepped out of the woods. The grays moved with an unnatural grace, gliding silently from the tree line. There were at least a dozen of them, their tall, thin bodies silhouetted against the dim light of dawn. Their black eyes seemed to pierce through Jack and Emma, unblinking and emotionless. "Keep moving!" Jack barked, raising his rifle. He fired at the nearest gray, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap. The creature staggered but didn't fall. It tilted its head as though studying the impact before stepping forward again. Emma froze, her legs refusing to move. "Jack, they're everywhere." Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "We don't stop. The truck is our only chance." Another gray moved to block their path. Jack aimed and fired again, hitting it square in the chest. This time it crumpled to the ground, its limbs folding awkwardly. The others didn't react, their focus unwavering. The hum grew louder, pressing against Emma's skull like a vice. Her vision blurred and she stumbled. Jack caught her, his voice sharp. "Emma, stay with me, focus." She nodded, forcing her legs to move. The truck was just ahead, its metallic surface reflecting the faint morning light. Jack fired again, forcing the grays to scatter momentarily, creating an opening. They ran, the hum vibrating through their bodies, making every step feel heavier. As they reached the truck, Jack threw open the driver's door and shoved Emma inside. "Lock the doors," he ordered, circling to the passenger side. He fired another shot, hitting a gray that had darted too close. Jack jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. He fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking. The grays were closing in, their movements faster now. One reached the truck, its spindly fingers clawing at the window. Emma screamed, shrinking back. Jack turned the key, and the engine roared to life. "Hold on," he yelled, slamming the truck into reverse. The tires spun on the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust as the truck lurched backward. The grays didn't flinch, their black eyes fixed on the vehicle. One climbed onto the hood, its elongated fingers tapping against the windshield. Jack swerved sharply, sending the creature tumbling off. He shifted into drive, the truck barreling down the narrow dirt road. "They're following us," Emma cried, glancing out the rear window. Shadows moved among the trees, keeping pace with the truck. The hum followed, an unrelenting reminder that they weren't safe. Jack pressed the accelerator, the truck bouncing over the uneven road. "We'll lose them," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The grays began appearing in front of them, stepping onto the road. Jack didn't hesitate, driving straight at them. They scattered, their movements unnervingly quick. The truck's tires skidded on the loose gravel, but Jack kept control, his grip white-knuckled on the wheel. Emma clutched her seat, her heart racing. The hum grew fainter as the truck roared onto the main road, leaving the forest behind. Emma dared to hope they were safe, but as she glanced at her arm, her stomach dropped. A faint circular burn had appeared on her skin. The hum was gone. The silence that replaced it was suffocating in its own way, broken only by the rumble of the truck's engine. Jack kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Emma sat beside him, staring at the faint circular burn on her arm. It was no larger than a quarter, its edges unnaturally precise. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack glanced at her arm, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, but it wasn't there before." Emma's breath quickened, panic rising. "It's like the journal said, we're marked. What does that mean? What happens now?" Jack shook his head, his voice calm but strained. "We keep moving. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. But first we put as much distance as we can between us and that cabin." Emma nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. She turned to look out the window, watching as the dense forest gave way to open fields and eventually small towns. The world outside felt normal, untouched by the horrors they had just escaped. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly left the grays behind. Hours later, they pulled into the parking lot of a motel on the outskirts of a small town. Jack parked the truck and leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "We'll rest here for the night, figure out our next steps in the morning." Emma nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the burn mark. She followed Jack into the motel, the fluorescent lights of the lobby feeling almost alien after the oppressive darkness of the woods. They checked in and made their way to their room, the door closing with a heavy thud that seemed to echo too long. Inside, Jack double-checked the locks while Emma sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. "Do you think they'll come after us again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack set his rifle and revolver on the nightstand, his movements slow and deliberate. "I don't know, but we'll be ready if they do." Emma nodded, though she felt anything but ready. She rubbed the burn on her arm absent-mindedly, the skin tender and warm to the touch. "Why us?" she murmured. "What do they want?" Jack didn't have an answer. He sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." That night, Emma dreamed of black eyes staring at her from the shadows, their presence as inescapable as the mark on her arm. She woke in a cold sweat, the hum from the woods still ringing faintly in her ears. As she sat up trying to calm her racing heart, her eyes fell on the mirror across the room. For a moment she thought she saw something, tall, thin, and gray, standing just behind her, but when she turned, the room was empty. Jack stirred beside her, muttering in his sleep. Emma touched her arm, feeling the burn again, and knew deep down that they hadn't escaped. The grays had marked them, and whatever they wanted wasn't finished. In the shadows beyond the motel window, a pair of black, unblinking eyes watched. Silent, patient, waiting. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.